I never imagined the woman I loved could be so cold. The moment I heard her voice, whispering his name, my world shattered. 3 years of my life, gone in a flash, traded for another man's touch. She thought she could take everything: my love, my money, my dignity. But she forgot one thing: I'm not a man to cross. Now, as I walk away from the ruins of our marriage, she's left with nothing but the ashes of her deceit. This isn't just the end of us. It's the beginning of her reckoning. And as I disappear into the shadows, she'll finally understand what it means to lose everything. I thought the day couldn't get any worse, but I was wrong. This whole week at work had been tough. To make it worse, my boss called me into his office and scolded me for a mistake someone else made. When I finally got home, I found my sister-in-law's car blocking my driveway. I couldn't even park in front of my own house. The neighbors had their teenage son over, and there were cars all along the curb by their house. I had to park 3 doors down. I wasn't even sure why I was going inside. My wife's sister, Susan, and I had never gotten along since the first time we met. I didn't get why she seemed to dislike me right away. I also knew that I wasn't going to have a good evening. I hadn't spent much time with my wife, Janice, in almost a month, even though I had tried. As I walked toward the house, I saw the empty trash can by the curb. I dragged it around the side of the house and put it by the back door. When I stepped into the kitchen, I heard music from the living room and my wife talking to her sister. I opened the fridge, grabbed a beer, and took a long drink before heading for the living room. Just as I reached the door, I heard something that made me stop. God, he mentioned spending time together today. It wasn't Susan's voice, it was Janice's. Ever since Brandon came back last month, I've been thinking about him a lot, she said. I had never met Brandon, but I knew he was my wife's ex-boyfriend who had moved away. So what are you going to do now? Susan asked. Brandon wants me to think about moving in with him, so I'll get a lawyer and file for divorce, Janice said. We live in a community property state, so I'll get half of everything. That was enough for me. I walked back to my car like I was in a daze. I sat in the driver's seat and realized why my wife and I hadn't been close. She was moving on with someone else, and now she wanted half of everything we had. Janice and I had been married for 3 years. Shortly after our wedding, she quit her job. When she was home, she never did anything around the house. I paid for a maid to come 3 times a week to clean and do the laundry. On those days, she even made dinner. The rest of the time, I either cooked or we ordered takeout. Sure, I was in love and maybe a little foolish. She made me happy during the early days, but that changed about a month ago. My mother died when I was 13, and it hit both my father and me hard. She had been the center of our lives. We struggled at first, but eventually we learned to cope with our loss. My dad did his best to raise me well, and I think he did a good job. We were very close, and it was a big shock when I lost him to a drunk driver when I was 23, just before I met Janice. Dad left everything to me. I inherited almost $2.5 million. It was a lot of money, but not much compared to today's billionaires. I had never spent the money, choosing to keep it invested. With a good broker's help, my savings grew, even with the tough economy. I made enough that I didn't have to dip into my savings. Even with Janice trying to spend it all, I still had another $100,000 saved up. I loved Janice, and we didn't have a prenuptial agreement. Like many men, I foolishly thought our marriage would last forever. Now, I realized she could take almost $1.5 million from me. She talked about getting a lawyer. That meant she wasn't ready to serve me with divorce papers yet. I still had time to act. I thought about a plan as I sat in my car. I watched the rearview mirror until I saw my sister-in-law's car back out and leave. Then, I started my car and drove back into my driveway. When I walked into the house, Janice was nowhere to be found, so I went to the kitchen for another drink. I opened another beer and took a long swig. "Oh, there you are, honey," Janice said, walking into the kitchen. "I didn't hear you come in." "Hi, dear, just got home. It's been a long day," I said with a smile. I wanted to show her I could pretend too. "I didn't have time to order dinner," she said with a little frown. What I wanted to say was, "That's because you spent the day with someone else." But instead I said, "That's okay, sweetie. I'll heat up some leftovers from last night." Janice smiled and came over. "I'm going to take a hot bath," she said. I nodded and smiled. After she left, I pulled out a box of fried rice and ate it cold as I finished my drink. I threw the empty container in the trash and went to sit in my recliner. I flipped through the channels until I found an old John Wayne movie. After about half an hour, Janice came back down and sat on the couch until the movie ended. Then she said she was tired and going to bed. I told her nicely that I would watch the news and be up shortly. I hadn't really watched the movie. My mind was busy thinking about what to do next. I knew there was nothing I could do until Monday morning, so I just had to get through the next few days. On Saturday, I worked in the yard, and on Sunday, I played golf with friends I was going to miss. On Monday, I called my broker who managed my inheritance. I asked him to sell everything. One good thing about being in management was that I could quickly cash in my 401k. By Thursday, I was ready to act. I went home to my wife and told her I had an urgent matter to attend to. I would leave the next day for work and might be gone for a week. I packed 2 suitcases. That was all I needed. When we moved into this house, I had put my important things in storage. They didn't match her style, so I didn't want them around. She chose the furniture, and I didn't mind it. One good thing was that we were renting the house, so I didn't lose money on it. I had sold my condo, and we were searching for the right house to buy. By right, I meant what she wanted. So far, the places we saw just weren't right. On Friday morning, I said goodbye to my wife and took my suitcases out the door. I loaded them into my Lexus and drove off, not looking back. My first stop was to see my old friend Jake, whom I trusted. He was surprised when I told him I wanted to trade my car for his older, rebuilt 4-wheel drive. I explained my situation, and an hour later, I was heading west. I didn't think anyone would connect me to my old car. Jake said he would keep my car safe in his garage for a while. For the next 4 days, I paid cash for everything. I had canceled all our credit cards, leaving no paper trail. Most of my money was safe in an offshore account, thanks to my broker. I had a plan with him to transfer funds when I needed to. I hid enough cash in the SUV to last for a while. The nights alone in motels were the hardest. For the past week, I had been too busy to think about how I felt after everything that happened. I had loved Janice. I wouldn't have married her if I hadn't. I thought about what could have happened differently, but in the end, I realized there wasn't much I could change. I came to 2 conclusions. First, I didn't think she ever truly loved me. I was just a way for her to get what she wanted. Second, it was my fault for being too trusting to marry her. On the 5th day of my escape, I sat in a warm diner in a small town in Montana. I wondered what my wife was doing, as she must have discovered that all her credit cards were canceled and our bank account was empty. My thoughts were interrupted by an older couple talking at the next table. Even though they spoke softly, I could hear them. The man was telling his wife that he wished he could hire someone for help, but they couldn't afford it until their calves were ready for market. Even then, nobody wanted to work for the money they could offer. The man looked to be in his late 50s. His hair was mostly gray now, but you could tell it used to be dark. His wife had beautiful red hair and bright blue eyes. I finished my meal and walked over to their table. "I'm sorry to listen in on your talk, but maybe I can help," I said. The older man looked me up and down. "I don't see how you can help. If you hurt us, you know I can't pay you." "What if I just need a place to stay in exchange for my work?" I offered. He squinted at me. "Colleen, could you excuse us for a moment?" he said to his wife. He stood up and motioned for me to follow him outside. Once we were in the parking lot where it was quiet, he faced me. He looked about my height, 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and no extra weight. His face had the rough looks of a man who worked outside. His dark brown eyes seemed to study me carefully. "Who are you? Are you part of that Wilson family?" he asked. I held up my hands to show I meant no harm. "Wait a minute. I don't know any Wilsons. I was in Texas 4 days ago, and I just arrived here today. I thought we could help each other." "If you're telling the truth, why would you want to help us? I can't pay you anything. What do you get out of it? If you're running from the law, we don't want trouble." "I might be on the run," I said, "but not in the way you think." I shared my story about my wife, who wanted to take everything from me, and my need for a place to stay for a while. "I haven't hurt anyone. I just want to keep what belongs to me. If you have a place for me, I'll work for you. You don't have to pay me. If I'm not helpful, just say so, and I'll leave without hard feelings." He studied my face closely. "Son, if what you say is true, I'd be foolish not to give you a chance. But you need to know that the Wilsons want to buy my land from me. They haven't done anything sneaky yet, but I wouldn't put it past them. You might be taking a risk, he warned. I told him I was okay with taking that risk. He then asked if I had any experience working on a ranch. I told him honestly that I had spent some summers at my uncle's ranch in Texas, but I wasn't a real cowboy. He extended his hand, and we shook on our deal. He told me to call him Bill, and I introduced myself. We headed back into the diner where his wife sat waiting. "Colleen, this is Carson Jones. He's going to work for us if he can handle it," Bill said. Colleen stood up and shook my hand. "It's very nice to meet you, Carson," she said. Her voice was clear with a slight trace of an Irish accent. Like her husband, she was fit and healthy. She seemed very friendly. "It's nice to meet you too, Mrs." I realized I didn't know Bill's last name. "Buckman. My last name is Buckman, but you can just call me Colleen. We don't really use formal names here," she said with a smile. I liked her right away. Bill said I could follow them back to the ranch. Before we left town, he stopped at a general store, and I got out of the truck to join him. "I thought you might want to buy some clothes for ranch work," he suggested. "Yeah, you're right. What I have won't last long," I replied, thankful he thought of this. When we walked into the store, the owner greeted Bill warmly. It was clear he came here often. 40 minutes later, I had enough jeans and work shirts for a week, plus a coat and some riding boots. This was a good start. From the store, it was about a 25-mile drive to the ranch gate, which had the name Rocking Bee Ranch above it. This was Bill's brand, a Rocking Bee. We drove one more mile down a private road to the main house. The house was 2 stories, well cared for, and looked freshly painted. Behind it, I could see a barn and several other buildings. The truck was loaded with bags of groceries, and I figured this was their weekly trip for supplies. I parked behind them and helped carry in the bags. After 2 trips, we had everything unloaded. Bill told me to drive around back to see where I would stay. As I pulled around, I saw him in front of a small cabin. He said I could use that one, pointing to another cabin nearby and saying it was for Sam. He mentioned that Sam was out working and I would meet him later. Bill waited for me while I brought in my bags. The cabin had one large room with a bed against one wall and a table with 2 chairs. There was a small wood stove in one corner and a bathroom with a shower. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean. It would be a good place to stay and hopefully keep me out of Janice's way. When I stepped outside, Bill was sitting in his truck telling me to hop in. He took me for a ride around the ranch. He had almost 6,000 acres, with 5,000 being flat land perfect for grazing. There were a couple hundred acres for growing winter feed. The back part of the ranch was hilly and covered in trees. In the distance, I could see mountains, and a stream flowed through the property. Bill said the back area could only be accessed on horseback. He shared that he used to have 3 workers, but now only Sam was left because times had been tough. Sam had worked on the ranch for almost 30 years. During the roundup, when they sorted livestock for market, Bill hired extra hands. At 5 o'clock, he dropped me back at the little cabin. "Oh, by the way," Bill said, noticing my laptop, "I have a satellite connection so you can use the internet. Supper is at the main house, and we usually eat at 6. Then he drove off. I took less than 30 minutes to put away my things, leaving me time to turn on my computer. Just as Bill had said, I could connect to the internet. I checked my email, I had a new account, and there was a message from Jake. He mentioned that if he heard anything about Janice, he would let me know. Apparently, she had reported me missing to the police, and they were looking for me. This made me think. Jake was the only one I had told I was leaving, and he didn't know where I had gone, as I hadn't known either. I had sent my resignation to my job, but hadn't told them face to face. Just before 6, I walked over to the main house and knocked on the kitchen door. Bill called for me to come in. I stepped inside and saw Colleen setting the food on the table. Bill was talking to a man I assumed was Sam. Bill waved me over. "Sam, this is Carson, the new hand I mentioned, at least for today. We'll see how he feels after work tomorrow," Bill said with a big smile. "Carson, this is Sam." Sam smiled widely and extended his hand. He was a tall man, about 6'3", and looked like hard work was his life. He seemed to be around the same age as Bill. Also, he was African American. I shook his hand and felt his strong grip. "Well, young man, let's hope you like it here. I could use some help," he said. I guessed at 28 I was about half his age. I plan to give it my best shot, I replied. Just then, Colleen told us to sit down because dinner was ready. Bill and Colleen sat at opposite ends of the table, leaving Sam and me to sit across from each other. The table had a large plate of pork chops, a big bowl of mashed potatoes, and another bowl of fresh green beans. There was also a plate of homemade biscuits. "We don't eat fancy here, Carson," Colleen said, "but there's plenty, and it's good." It looked delicious and my mouth watered. "It looks great," I replied. As the food was passed around and our plates filled, I could tell Colleen was a good cook. While we ate, I asked Bill if he had lived here all his life. "Yep. My grandfather started this ranch, then passed it to my father. Now it's mine and Colleen's," Bill said, pausing for a moment to think. "When I was younger, I wasn't sure she would be part of my life. I had to push away many men for her." Bill looked at his wife, and I could see how much he loved her in his eyes. "Now, Bill, you know you're the only man I ever cared for. I just needed to know you really wanted me," Colleen said. "My wife has made me so happy on 3 special days. The day she said yes to marry me, the day we got married, and the day our daughter Caitlin was born," Bill said. I hadn't seen a daughter around, and Colleen must have noticed my confused look. "Our daughter is away right now. She's finishing her veterinarian degree at South Dakota State. Caitlin can only come home for holidays, and we are looking forward to her returning with her degree. She should be home in a couple of months," Colleen said. "It'll be great to have a vet in the family. We could save some money," Bill said with a smile. After dinner, I tried to help wash the dishes, but Colleen said it was her job and told me to step aside. Bill reminded me that breakfast was at 5:30 and we would start working at 6. As Sam and I were leaving, I spotted a copy of the New York Times on the counter. Bill must have picked it up in town. I asked if I could borrow the front page, and he said yes. Once we were outside, I asked Sam to come to my cabin for a moment. We went inside, and I took out my camera and showed him how to use it. I asked him to take a picture of me holding the newspaper. I could see he was curious about why I wanted the picture, but he didn't ask. He did wonder if I had an alarm clock, and I told him I did. He said he would see me in the morning and headed out. I uploaded the picture to my computer and attached it to an email for the police in my old hometown. I wrote that I was alive and well and had left town on my own. Using a local paper could hint at where I was. This way, I could be anywhere. I sent the email to Jake and told him to go to a local coffee shop with free internet. I thought my work email would still be active, so I gave him my password. That way, he could send my original email and picture to the police without leaving clues. I hoped this would keep the police from listing me as missing. I didn't think they would search too hard for a husband who chose to leave. I slept well that night. I woke up at 5 the next morning, took a shower, and got dressed in time to walk with Sam to the main house. Breakfast was eggs, sausage, hash browns, and toast. There was plenty for everyone. After we ate, Bill told Sam to take me to work replacing fence posts in the hills. Sam led me out to the barn and showed me a horse and saddle I would need. He watched closely as I put the saddle on a big brown mare. My time on my uncle's ranch helped, and Sam seemed pleased with my work. We then took 2 mules and loaded them with fence posts and a post hole digger. Bill came to the barn carrying a rifle. He said we might need it if we came across a cow that needed help. It didn't happen often, but it was better to be ready. Sam and I got on our horses, leading a mule each, and rode off. We followed the creek into the hills. As we rode, Sam and I talked and got to know each other. I shared how I ended up in Montana. I didn't think he would tell anyone my story. He talked about his past, too. He married young and went through tough times. After 5 years in prison, Bill was the only person who would hire him. That's how he ended up here for the last 30 years. He had a lot of respect for Bill and Colleen, saying they were wonderful people. The mountains looked amazing in the rising sun. It was early April, and the snow was melting in the lower areas, but still covered the peaks. When we reached the tree line, the trail began to climb. It took about half an hour to arrive at the fence that marked the property line. Sam pointed out that not all the posts needed replacing, just the rotten ones, which were about every 3rd one. He stayed to help me with the first 2 to show me the right way. Sam said if I worked until about 4, I would finish in time to care for the horse and mules and make it to dinner at 6. He told me to follow the stream back so I wouldn't get lost. Sam went back and I was left to work alone. There was something peaceful about being in this beautiful, hilly, forested land. I pulled out old posts and put in new ones along the fence. At noon, I took a break and enjoyed the pork chop sandwiches Colleen had packed for me. They were tasty leftovers from the previous night. As I quietly ate, I watched a blue jay fly through the trees. A woodpecker stopped by to peck at a tree. Then a white-tailed deer appeared on the other side of the fence. She stepped closer but caught my scent. She snorted and jumped back into the woods, waving her tail like a flag. After finishing my lunch, I went back to work. I had set the alarm on my watch and it beeped at 4 that afternoon. I saw that I had replaced all but a couple of the posts that the mules had carried up. I led the mules back along the fence until I found the stream and went downhill. Just before leaving the trees, I came upon a natural pool where the stream flowed in and out. I paused to enjoy the view. A small waterfall dropped over a 10-foot ledge into the clear water below. I felt this was the prettiest and most peaceful spot on the ranch. When I got back to the barn, I was just in time to unsaddle the mules and feed them. Sam came in to take care of his horse while I was there. When I told him I had set all but 2 of the fence posts, he looked surprised and impressed. We quickly washed up and changed to be ready for supper. That night, we had steaks to eat. Bill seemed really impressed when Sam told him about my work that day. I was tired and didn't say much at the table. Once dinner finished, I excused myself and went straight to bed. I fell asleep fast. When I woke up, I felt sore. My hands hurt from digging holes for the posts, along with my arms, shoulders, and legs. I thought I was in good shape because I worked out a few days a week, but there's a big difference between a 2-hour workout and a whole day of setting posts. As I limped into the kitchen and winced sitting down, Bill and Sam chuckled a bit. Even Colleen tried not to smile, but I was hungry and ate a lot of food. "Ready for another day of fencing?" Bill asked as we stood up from the table. I groaned. "Yes, sir," I said, trying to sound more excited than I felt. Bill laughed at me again. "I think you can take a break today. I want you to ride with Sam." I appreciated that. Our first job was to clean out the stalls and put in fresh hay. We let the horses and mules into the pasture and filled their feeder. Then we hopped into the pickup and drove around the land. We were checking to see if any cows were down or if any calves had wandered away from their mothers. The route Sam showed me was much longer than the one I took with Bill on my first day. Sam seemed to know where the cattle would be and how many there were. After 30 years on the ranch, this knowledge came naturally to him. When we reached the far end of the ranch, Sam stopped the truck and looked around. He noticed something up on one of the hills and pulled out his binoculars. He handed them to me and pointed to where I should look. After a moment, I spotted 2 calves that looked like they were alone. "Where are their mothers?" I asked. Sam pointed to 2 cows near the trees. "Those are them. The calves must have wandered into the trees and gotten lost. We need to bring them back down." "Are we going to hike up there?" I asked. "No, that's too far. We'll go back and get some horses." Sam used the truck's radio to tell Bill what we found and that we were on our way to get the horses. When we returned to the barn, Bill already had 2 horses saddled and loaded in a trailer. All we had to do was hook it up and leave. Sam drove us close to the trees where the calves were, and we got off the horses and rode up into the hills. Sam knew the land really well. Half an hour later, we quietly got behind the calves and began to guide them back down. I couldn't help but laugh when the calves saw their moms after we cleared the trees. They ran over to their mothers and immediately started nursing. The big cows stood calmly as their young fed. I thought about how I might have been scolded if I ran off from my mom instead of being welcomed back. For dinner that night, we had fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. The plate was full of perfectly cooked chicken pieces. I had more energy that night and talked more than I had the night before. I learned a lot more about Colleen. Her parents came from Ireland when she was 5. Her dad loved stories of the Old West and had moved to Montana. That's why she had a hint of an Irish accent. She grew up in America but still had her parents' influence in the way she spoke. The next day, I felt much better. After breakfast, I went back to replace the fence posts. Sam helped me load the mules, but I decided to go on my own. I just needed to follow the stream to get there. This day felt easier than the first because I learned some tricks to make the work less hard. Around 4 o'clock, I set the last post and headed back to the barn. I had some extra time, so I cleaned a few stalls before getting ready for dinner. On my 4th day, I helped Sam fix some of the buildings. The day after that, I set more fence posts. The next 2 months flew by. I started riding the range to check on the cattle, too. I was in the best shape I had ever been. We set a schedule where Sam took Saturdays off, Bill took Sundays off, and I took Mondays off. I used my day to do laundry and run into town if I needed anything. I had grown quite fond of everyone on the ranch. Sam was fun and laid back. We often sat and talked after dinner. I respected Bill a lot. He was honest and hard-working, and we got along well. Colleen was very kind to both Sam and me, but I could see she had a strong personality. She and Bill made a great couple. Colleen and Bill were excited now. At breakfast on Friday, Colleen told me that her daughter would be coming home in a week. It was my turn to ride a horse that day. I needed to check the hills for any cattle that might have wandered off. It was just after 4 o'clock when I got to the stream and decided to follow it down. When I reached the pool below the waterfall, I stopped and got off my horse. I knelt by the water and dipped my bandana in to cool off my face and neck. Suddenly, I heard a horse whinnying from upstream. I turned to my right and saw a rider coming towards me. At first, I thought it was Colleen, but then I realized it was a younger woman who looked just like her. This had to be Caitlin. She had the same bright blue eyes and red hair as her mom. She rode up and stopped a few feet away from me. She looked me over, and I could feel her eyes on me. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" she asked sharply. "I'm Carson and I work here," I answered. "I don't believe you. My dad told me he couldn't pay someone else," she said. "Yeah, I heard that too. I guess that's why I find it funny to get paid every paycheck," I joked. Caitlin glared at me and turned her horse around. I watched as she rode away quickly. I chuckled to myself, put my shirt back on, and got back on my horse to head to the barn. Later, I learned that there was a mix-up between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she was coming home next week. But, to their surprise, she had come home just a couple of hours after I had left. That morning, she had spent time with her parents and later told them she wanted to ride. She hadn't had time for that while in school, but she loved it. So she saddled up and rode to her favorite spot by the waterfall and pool. After 2 months away, I guess her parents forgot to mention me. As I turned the corner by the barn, I saw Caitlin going inside. I got off my horse and led it inside. Caitlin must have been looking for her dad, who I found in the barn. I could hear her loud voice clearly. "Who was that guy at the waterfall?" she asked. Bill thought for a moment. "That must have been Carson," he replied. "He said he works here, but the last time I was here you said you couldn't pay anyone," she argued. "Well, he is right. He works here. How much he gets paid is not your business, young lady. I still own this ranch," Bill said firmly. "Dad, he said he makes so much that he laughs all the way to the bank," she exclaimed. I had walked into the barn by now. Caitlin's back was to me, so she didn't see me, but Bill did, and he smiled at me. "Is that true, Carson? If you think you're overpaid, I can fix that," he said. Caitlin turned around and stared at me. I took off my hat and scratched my head. "Well, I wouldn't want to take advantage of you, Bill. How much do you plan to cut my pay?" I asked. Bill and I both burst out laughing. Caitlin shot us an annoyed look. "Just so you know, Carson gets to stay in the cabin next to Sam's," Bill said. "And what else?" she asked, still curious. "That, and he gets to enjoy your mom's cooking," he added. "Are you saying you don't pay him? Why would he work for free?" Caitlin pressed on. "He has his reasons, and it's not my place to explain," Bill replied. "Working just to have a chance to eat your mom's meals is worth a lot. I don't think she'd like to hear you say it's nothing," I said. Caitlin glared at me once more and stormed out of the barn. Bill shook his head. "She reminds me of her mom when she was young. I never thought I would calm down, Colleen." At dinner that night, Caitlin joined us. She sat next to Sam across the table from me. She gave me another sharp look when I walked into the kitchen. I waited until everyone had their plates filled before I spoke. "Your mom told me you finished your studies in veterinary medicine," I said kindly. "Yeah," was her short answer, and she didn't look up. "Sam mentioned that there's only one other vet around, and he's over 50 miles away. You're going to be very helpful to the people here," I said. Caitlin looked up at my compliment, and I thought her expression softened a bit. "Yes, Doc Harrison is very busy. He often has to be in 2 places at once," Colleen added. I agree with you, Carson. Caitlin will do a great job here. During the rest of the meal, Caitlin talked with her parents and Sam, who had been on the ranch longer than she had been alive. She didn't talk to me directly, and I mostly stayed quiet. This was her time to share about her life while she had been away. As soon as I finished eating, I excused myself and went back to my cabin. I checked my email and found a message from Jake. He told me he spoke to a friend on the police force and asked if they still thought I was missing. His friend said that they stopped looking after they got the email with my picture. As for Janice, it seemed Brandon had broken up with her as soon as he learned I had disappeared with all the money. Janice was now living in a small apartment and working as a waitress. She couldn't even afford a lawyer to chase after me. I found it funny. She probably married me just for my money, and her boyfriend did the same thing. I was still putting in new fence posts, but now I was only doing it every third or fourth day. I had moved from the hilly area and was now close enough to drive my truck to work. It was much easier to load the posts in the back of the truck instead of on the mules. The morning after Caitlin came back home, I loaded the truck with posts and drove to my work site. When it was time for lunch, I went to the truck and realized I had forgotten to bring my lunch. If anyone worked away from the main house all day, Colleen would make sure we had food, but I had completely forgotten mine. I could have driven back to the house, but I thought missing one meal wouldn't be a big deal. About 30 minutes later, after I had set a pole and was attaching the wire, I heard a vehicle coming. I looked back and saw it was one of the ranch trucks. The truck stopped just as I finished with that post. I turned around and was surprised to see Caitlin get out, holding a small bag like the ones Colleen used for our lunches. "Mama said you forgot your lunch," she said, giving me the bag. I took it from her hand. "Thank you, Caitlin. That was very nice of you," I said. I looked inside the bag and saw it had 2 sandwiches like usual. I took one out and offered the other to Caitlin, but she shook her head. I shrugged and sat on the back of the truck to eat. Caitlin stood nearby, watching me with interest. "Why are you here?" she asked after a moment. I looked at her and decided to joke a little. "You can't tell anyone. I stole money from a bank and I'm hiding here until it's safe to get it." At first, her eyes went wide. Then she frowned at me. "You're a real joker," she said and turned to leave. I waited until she was halfway to her truck. "Caitlin." She heard me call her name and stopped, slowly turning around. "I married a woman who never loved me and only wanted what I could give her. I came here just to get away from everything for a while." Caitlin looked at me again, and I think she realized I was being serious this time. She nodded and left without saying anything. As she drove away, I thought about what her dad had said about her mom being like Caitlin when she was younger. He said he had won Colleen over, but I guessed that their love was what made the difference. It had only been a day since I first met Caitlin, and I couldn't picture any guy winning over the fiery redhead. Dinner that night was quite similar to the night before. Caitlin was talking to her parents and Sam. I didn't mind. After all, she didn't know me and we had nothing in common. We were finishing dinner when there was a knock on the door, and Bill went to answer it. He came back into the kitchen with a man about my age. He was what women might call tall, dark, and handsome. Caitlin excitedly called out a name and jumped up to greet him. It was clear they knew each other well. They were chatting about how long it had been since they last saw each other. A few minutes later, there was another knock, and Bill returned with another man. This one was lighter-haired, but still good-looking. Caitlin greeted him just as warmly. I remembered what Bill said about having to keep every guy away from his wife to win her. Caitlin was just as much a prize in looks as her mom was. I excused myself from the table and went back to my cabin. I hoped the 2 guys would have luck with her. I did feel a little jealous, though. If Caitlin turned out to be like her mother, whoever won her heart would be very lucky. The next day, I took the truck and rode around the ranch. By the time I finished my rounds, something didn't feel right. It was early enough, so I went back to get Sam, and we quickly checked the ranch. There were a lot of cattle spread out, but we both thought something was missing. We decided that we would go ride the hilly parts the next day. We talked about it with Bill at dinner, and he agreed with our plan. It rained that night, which would make it harder to find tracks. The next morning, we loaded our horses into a trailer, and Bill drove us to one end of the ranch. I rode about a third of the way into the trees, and Sam rode a bit higher still. We then moved across the ranch, over the hills, and through the trees. It took most of the day to get to the other side. We found 5 stray cows. Bill met us as we came out of the hills, and we loaded the horses back into the trailer to head home. We talked about what to do and decided that we just needed to keep a closer watch on the herd. At dinner that night, Caitlin had another visitor. I heard her mom say that this was the third one that day. Word had spread that Caitlin was back, and guys were coming to see her. For the next 4 days, we watched the cattle closely. Everything seemed fine except for the ones we thought were missing. Caitlin's visitors kept coming, and she hadn't said a word to me since she brought me my lunch. On the 5th day after the missing cattle, I told Bill I wanted to check the fence line through the hills. We had already looked along the pasture areas and found nothing. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch where Bill's land met the Wilson Ranch. About halfway to the southwest corner, I spotted 3 fresh sets of horse tracks. They moved from the Wilson side of the fence to Bill's side. It was strange because the fence wire was still up. I got off my horse and checked the fence posts. I saw that the staples were loose on 5 posts and held the wire up only weakly. If you took out the staples and lowered the wire, anyone could cross. If you put the wire and staples back, it looked just fine. I got back on my horse and followed the tracks. Near the stream, I spotted 3 horses tied to a tree above the waterfall. I was still 30 yards away. I quickly tied my horse to a tree and took my rifle from its case. I moved quietly through the trees, keeping my eyes open. When I got to the horses, I saw boot prints heading downstream. I crept up to the edge of the waterfall and looked over, surprised by what I saw. Suddenly, I noticed movement in the trees. I quickly looked around and saw 1 man to my right and 2 more close to the pond on my left. I raised my rifle and shot. The bullet hit the ground between the feet of the man on the right. I fired again, and dirt flew up between the 2 on the left. Caitlin shouted, and I stood up so everyone could see me. "Lie down on your bellies now!" I shouted. "I won't miss my next shot!" I yelled. "Caitlin, stay put!" Caitlin hadn't seen the 3 men. All she saw was me standing there with a rifle. "Are you crazy, Carson?" she yelled. One of the guys on the left looked like he might run. I pulled the trigger again, and the bark from the tree right next to his face exploded. He dropped down. Caitlin looked where I shot and screamed again. I said, "Lie down. 3, 2. Before I could say 1, the other 2 dropped down too. "Now put your faces in the dirt and your hands behind your heads." They did as I said. "Caitlin, you can come out now. Get dressed." "But Carson," she started to protest. "Just do what I say. Get dressed and get out of here," I insisted. She was clearly scared, but she listened. She walked out of the water and quickly put on her jeans and shirt. Then she hopped onto her horse. With 1 kick, she was gone into the trees. Once she left, I ordered the men 1 by 1 to come up and lay back down. When all 3 were flat in front of me, I felt some relief. It was time to act tough. "What should I do with you 3? I paused for effect. "I could just shoot you." The 3 men began to beg for their lives. "Even if I don't kill you, Caitlin's dad will when he learns what you were doing. The best thing you can do is confess something to the sheriff that might help you, like stealing cattle." The smallest of them broke and said, "Yes, we did it." Wilson said if he could break Buckman, he could take his land. One of the others told him to shut up. "I ain't dying over no cows," the little guy shot back. I knew Caitlin would ride fast to find her dad, and he would come to see what happened. For now, I decided to wait. Sure enough, 45 minutes later, both Bill and Sam came riding into view. I waved, and they raced up to the top of the waterfall. "What's going on?" Bill shouted from his horse. He looked down at the 3 men lying face first. "Looks like some of Wilson's hands decided to visit us." I showed them the tracks from the fence line to where we were. Caitlin was swimming, and the 3 men were trying to sneak up on her. I walked over to my captures and pressed my rifle gently against the smaller man's neck. "I think this one has something to tell you." I pressed again. "We took some of your cattle, but it was Wilson's idea," he admitted. Bill adjusted his hat and smiled. "You know, when my grandfather started this ranch, they dealt with horse thieves and cattle rustlers pretty seriously. Seems that was justice. It's a shame we have to be more polite now." Sam kept an eye on our uninvited guests while Bill and I talked quietly. We decided to march them back down. With our rifles ready, Bill and I followed them, and Sam tied their horses together and brought up the back. When we reached the buildings, we took the rustlers into the barn, putting them in separate stalls where they could see us. but not each other. Bill went to the house to call the sheriff while Sam and I kept watch. Less than 30 minutes later, the sheriff arrived quickly. I talked with him and Bill about what had happened. I suggested we bring out the little guy first to talk. The sheriff agreed, and soon I had my prisoner standing outside. He looked scared and hesitant to speak. "We have a simple case of trespassing here. I don't want to waste my time on this. I could just leave them here and let you deal with it how you want," the sheriff said. The small rustler's eyes got wide with fear, and he suddenly started to talk. The sheriff quickly uncovered the truth. He called for backup, and soon a line of sheriff cars arrived at Wilson's ranch. The rustler revealed where the stolen cattle were, and they found almost 100 head with the Rocking Bee brand. By the end of the day, Wilson and his men were taken into custody. After all the excitement, it was after 9 before we could finally sit down for dinner. Caitlin sat at the table but stared at her plate. "What were you doing up there?" Bill asked her, since he hadn't had much chance to talk. "I was just swimming. I didn't think anyone would come up," she replied, glancing at me with annoyance. "First of all, Caitlin," I said, "I wasn't watching you. I followed the horse tracks to the stream. I thought about what could have happened if I hadn't been there. I don't think those 3 guys were out there to enjoy a picnic when they saw you swimming," I said. Caitlin's face turned bright red. "Thank goodness you got there when you did, Carson," Colleen said. "I hate to think of what could have happened." Everyone quickly changed the subject, and we hurried through our meal. We had to wake up early the next day. I left the kitchen and headed to my cabin. I was halfway there when Caitlin called out to me. I paused and waited for her. "So, did you enjoy the view today?" she said sharply. I figured it was too much to hope she would thank me. "Let's just say I would be lying if I said it wasn't amazing," I replied. Caitlin just snorted and stomped off toward the house. I stood there shaking my head. It seemed like I always annoyed her. The next day, Bill had to go to town to officially file charges against Wilson. It would take a few days before we could bring the stolen cattle back home. The prosecutor had to write everything down first. Sam and I spent the day painting some buildings. We had lunch in the kitchen, but Caitlin didn't join us, which I didn't mind at all. Bill returned in the early afternoon, but waited until dinner to tell us what happened. He explained that since this wasn't a serious case, Wilson and his crew would be let out on bail. He thought they wouldn't cause any more trouble, but he told us to stay alert. Bill looked at his daughter and smiled. "If you're going swimming anytime soon, maybe you should take Carson with you to watch out for you," he joked, making Caitlin turn bright red again. She jumped up, kicked her chair back, and ran out of the room. Bill and Sam burst into laughter, and even Colleen chuckled. I couldn't help but laugh too. Once things settled down, we went back to eating, but Bill wasn't done teasing. "I really want to thank you, Carson. Wilson could have really put us in trouble. You're worth every cent I pay you." We all laughed again. 3 days later, Bill heard that he could get his cattle back. We loaded 3 horses into a trailer and drove to Wilson's gate, which said it was the Flying W Ranch. We had a sheriff with us to take us to where the stolen cattle were kept. Colleen came along to drive the truck and trailer back once we unloaded the horses. Bill, Sam, and I started moving the cows back to his ranch. I felt like I was in a cowboy movie. When we got close to the Rocking Bee Ranch, I rode ahead and opened a spot in the fence so the cattle could cross. Once we got all the cattle back in the right place, we fixed the fence and rode back to the main house, feeling good about what we had done. Caitlin had applied for her vet license. It usually took about 45 days to get approved, so she was busy taking care of the animals on her dad's ranch. I would see her around and, of course, at mealtimes. She still ignored me, but if I caught her eye, I'd smile big, which always made her blush. It was 2 weeks after the waterfall incident when we were both in the barn. "Have you gone swimming recently?" I asked, trying to make her smile. Caitlin walked over and stood close, glaring at me. "Why are you such a jerk?" she snapped. I shrugged and smiled. "Why are you being so hard to deal with?" Her hand went up, but I was quick and grabbed her wrist before she could do anything. I pushed her hands behind her back, trying to keep it fun. I leaned closer until there was not much space between us. Caitlin watched my face, wide-eyed, without pulling away. "If you were with me, I would make you think about your attitude," I whispered. Caitlin gasped. "You wouldn't dare," she replied, trying to step back. Just then, I let go of her wrist, and she stumbled before regaining her balance. It's not that I wouldn't dare. I just got rid of one girl who didn't care about me, and I'm not going to waste time on someone who might not either. Until now, Caitlin had always walked away, but this time, I turned and left the barn, leaving her looking surprised. I didn't see her again until dinner. She didn't talk to me, but did look at me in a way I couldn't figure out. Not that I ever thought I understood women anyway. The next day, I was in the barn cleaning stalls when Bill came in. It was Sunday, so I guessed he wasn't there for work. He wanted to talk. I wondered if Caitlin had told him what happened yesterday. "I hear you and Caitlin had a bit of a clash yesterday," he said. This confirmed that she had shared her side. I could see a glimmer in Bill's eyes. "Yeah, you could say that. It was probably my fault," I admitted. "Maybe so, maybe not. I think her problem is that she doesn't know what to make of you. At first, she thought you might be here because you wanted something. Then you turned into the hero who saved her and the ranch. What she can't understand is why you aren't chasing her like the other young men. Caitlin is used to having guys wrapped around her finger. She's had a few boyfriends, but they never stayed around. I don't think she respected them. I just hope you don't let her scare you away. In my book, you're welcome here for as long as you want." "Thanks, Bill. That means a lot," I said. "As for Caitlin, I'll stop teasing her and hopefully we can get along." Bill left the barn, and I went back to work. I had the whole day to think about what Bill said. If Caitlin wanted to understand me, she should just talk to me nicely. I wasn't going to act like the others chasing her. Caitlin didn't come for dinner that night. No one mentioned it, and I didn't ask about it either. The next morning, I woke up at 5 as usual, even though it was my day off. It was easier to keep the same routine, so I didn't sleep in. I had breakfast, and after Sam and Bill left for work, I took care of my laundry. Bill had bought a big washer and dryer so I could wash all my clothes in one go. The laundry room was next to the kitchen, so while my clothes were washing, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Colleen and I were talking when Caitlin walked in. She usually didn't have breakfast with us and ate later. "Any plans for today?" Colleen asked me. "I was thinking of driving into town. Do you need anything?" I replied. "Yes, if you don't mind, there are a couple of things I need," she said. "I'd be happy to help," I said. "Can I ride into town with you?" Caitlin asked. I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "I need to go to the general store, and it seems silly for both of us to drive," she explained. "Sure, I'd be glad to give you a ride," I said, still surprised. After yesterday, I didn't expect her to talk to me, let alone want to go anywhere with me. "I'll leave in about an hour and a half after I finish my laundry." "Okay, I'll be ready," Caitlin said. She made herself some food and sat at the table, but she stayed quiet while Colleen and I talked. Caitlin must have been watching because she came out the back door as soon as I stepped out of my cabin. She wore a pretty turquoise dress that looked nice with her red hair. Her skin was smooth, and unlike many redheads, she and her mom didn't have freckles. She walked towards me with grace, looking into my eyes as she got closer. I opened the passenger door for her and watched as she slid in. We started driving, and for the first part of the trip, she sat quietly looking at the fields. "I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday," she said out of nowhere. I looked at her quickly but couldn't see her face because she was looking out the window. "While that might have been nice, I don't want to push feelings on someone who doesn't want them," I answered. I could see her turn her head to look at me, but she still stayed quiet. I noticed she kept glancing over at me. We reached the general store and we went inside. I needed some new jeans and shirts. Caitlin had a list of items for her mother, and an hour later we had everything packed up. I still needed to stop at the hardware store to pick up a few things for Bill, but it was lunchtime and I was hungry. I suggested we grab a bite to eat, and Caitlin agreed. I drove us to the diner where I first met Bill and Colleen. We sat across from each other and ordered our meals. Once again, we fell into silence, and I started to think that I should have just gone to the hardware store and then back to the ranch. Just then, the door opened and 3 guys walked in. I recognized 2 of them from when they came to visit Caitlin. They headed straight for our table. 2 of them sat down by her, and the third one stood behind me. They didn't talk to me and began chatting with Caitlin. I stood up and told the third guy to take a seat. I noticed Caitlin glare at me as I moved to the next table. When the waitress brought our food, I waved her over and had her serve mine in front of me. I ate quickly, trying to ignore the conversation at Caitlin's table. After a bit, I left some money on the table to pay for our meals and stood up. Caitlin hadn't eaten much, and her plate was still mostly full. "I'll go to the hardware store now. I can come back later to see if you're ready to leave," I said, interrupting their talk. Caitlin pushed her plate away and stood up. "I'll go with you. It was nice to see you guys again, but we have to go," she said. The guys tried to protest. One even offered her a ride home. She just said no and followed me outside. I drove to the hardware store and got out. Caitlin stayed in the car, looking upset. She stayed quiet as we drove back to the ranch and turned onto the long driveway. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" I replied, unsure of what she meant. "Get up and sit at the other table," she said. "Oh, that. I thought you would rather be with your friends. Besides, I didn't want to be in the way of them trying to impress you," I explained. "You can be really frustrating," she said. I chose to stay quiet. I didn't want to deal with any trouble while I was driving. When we reached the main house, I opened the back of the SUV, and Caitlin quickly grabbed what she could carry. I took some more bags and followed her inside. As I walked in the back door, she dumped everything on the kitchen table and walked out without saying a word to her mom. Colleen looked at me with a puzzled expression. I shrugged and said, "I guess I'm just being a jerk." Colleen laughed and came over to put her hand on my arm. "I've never seen anyone affect Caitlin like you do," she said quietly. "I must be good at annoying her," I replied. "I'm not sure about that," she said, making me feel a bit lost. I headed back to my cabin to put away my new clothes. Not wanting to stay inside, I went to the barn and saddled a horse. I rode out and ended up at the waterfall. It was a beautiful day, so I tied the horse to a tree and sat at the edge, looking down at the clear water. I sat there for what felt like a long time when I saw Caitlin ride up below me. She got off her horse. Not wanting to look like I was spying, I picked up a small stone and threw it down, making a splash. Caitlin looked around for the sound and saw me. I thought she would ride away, but instead she got on her horse and came up to me. She tied her horse next to mine and walked closer. I stood up and stepped back from the edge. "You're such a fool," she said, stopping just a breath away. "And you're still hard to deal with," I said. I didn't wait for her to reply. I reached out to her but paused, unsure of what to say. She grabbed my arm and turned me around. I was surprised when she smiled. "You're impossible," she said with a cheeky grin. "Stubborn," I replied, and at that moment something changed. We shared a quiet understanding. There was tension in the air, but I took a step back, thinking we needed to talk. I pointed toward the view and asked, "Want to look at the waterfall?" Caitlin looked at me, thought for a second, and nodded. We moved to the edge together, looking down at the water. The mood shifted to something calmer. We talked about everything and nothing, letting our earlier fight fade away. Gradually, we both relaxed and stayed close together. "Am I really that hard to handle?" she asked softly. I chuckled at her. "You definitely have your moments." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I looked at her fiery red hair and wondered if I had softened her. I thought about Bill and Colleen and how much they loved each other. I imagined having that kind of life with Caitlin. "Let's go for a swim," Caitlin whispered. I nodded, and we got our clothes and led our horses down to the pool. I watched as she walked into the cool water. We stepped in until the water was up to our chests, and Caitlin came closer to me. Caitlin rested her head on my shoulder, and we enjoyed a quiet moment together until the cold water made us leave. In silence, we got dressed and rode back down to the barn. We put our horses away, and then Caitlin came up to me and wrapped her arms around my neck. Without saying anything, she turned and walked to the main house. I walked back to my cabin in a daze and jumped into the shower. Hot water flowed over me, and I thought about what just happened. I realized I had stronger feelings for this lovely woman than I had ever admitted before. I had just enough time to get ready for dinner. When I walked into the kitchen, Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already there, but Caitlin was missing. Just as we sat down, she walked in. Instead of sitting by Sam like usual, she chose the chair next to mine. Bill and Colleen stared at her, but Caitlin just smiled sweetly back at them. During dinner, Caitlin talked happily. Even though her parents were curious, they didn't ask her why she seemed so cheerful. After dinner, Caitlin helped her mom clean the kitchen while Sam and I went back to our cabins. I was just getting into bed when I heard a soft knock at my door. I opened it and Caitlin slipped inside and into my arms. We shared a gentle moment before she joined me in bed. 5 in the morning came too fast and I turned off the alarm. Caitlin was still cuddled up next to me, letting out a little noise at the sound. It took a lot of effort to get out of bed. I turned on the bathroom light and got dressed for the day. I leaned over and gave Caitlin a soft kiss on the head before leaving the cabin. At breakfast, I noticed the looks from Bill and Colleen. I wondered if they knew where their daughter spent the night. After breakfast, I went out to load the truck for another day of putting up fence posts. Working alone on the ranch gave me time to think. It amazed me that only 3 months had passed since I left my wife. It felt like years. I thought about Bill, Colleen, and Sam and how much they meant to me. Then I thought about Caitlin and what we shared yesterday. I wondered if I could find a love like her parents had. During lunch, I realized I left my lunch again. As I thought about it, a pickup truck pulled up quickly and stopped. Caitlin jumped out with a bag in her hand. "Mama said you forgot your lunch," she said, giggling. I appreciated her thoughtfulness. We talked for a while, and I shared stories about my past. Caitlin talked about her worries about me leaving. "Caitlin, the only way I'll go is if you ask me to," I told her. Caitlin went back home after a while, and I finished my workday. I returned to my cabin, showered, and changed. That evening, she was in the kitchen when I walked in and sat next to me. Halfway through our meal, there was a knock at the front door, and Bill went to see who it was. He came back with the same guy who had visited Caitlin before. Caitlin stayed in her chair, watching him. "I was wondering if you'd like to go for a drive," he said. In this quiet part of the country, go for a drive often meant going on a date. "Thank you for the offer," Caitlin replied, "but I don't think my boyfriend would like that." She leaned over and smiled at me. The man left, looking embarrassed. Now everyone knew. I looked at Bill and Colleen, who were smiling. Even Sam was grinning. We were officially a couple now. In a few days, no more local men came to see Caitlin because she made it clear she was not available. I found a way to help Caitlin. She needed a loan to buy the equipment to start her veterinary business. The bank wouldn't give her an unsecured loan, and the only way to secure it was to ask her father to use the ranch as a backup. She didn't want to ask him for that. I told her to give me a couple of days because I might know a solution. I contacted my overseas bank to create an account under a fake loan company. I had Caitlin fill out a loan application on my computer and send it. I tricked it so the application would come to my email. A couple of days later, I sent her a notice that her loan was approved and money would be sent to her account. Caitlin was very happy, but asked why the loan only had a 2% interest rate. I told her they were a non-profit group that helped people who would serve the community. I could have just given her the money, but I knew she wouldn't accept it. She worked hard for her degree and wanted to succeed on her own. When her license was approved, she bought a new van. She turned it into a mobile vet office filled with the right medical tools. Once people knew she was licensed, many local ranchers called her for help. Caitlin spent many nights with me at my cabin. Bill and Colleen knew but didn't mind. She was 27, old enough to make her own choices. It took 3 months for Wilson and his workers to go to trial. It was clear he was guilty. The small guy had agreed to testify against him and got 2 years of probation. The 5 others who worked for Wilson were given 5 years in prison. Wilson, as the leader, received the maximum 10 years and a $50,000 fine. After Wilson went to prison, I started looking into his life and ranch. He was single and had no family nearby. With his workers in prison, no one was left to run the ranch. I had a new plan, but first I needed to finish old business. I had to get a divorce. However, I didn't want Janice to take half of my money. To do this, I asked my friend Jake to help me again. I called him instead of emailing. I wanted him to talk to Janice and say I wanted to offer her $50,000 for the divorce. If she didn't accept, she would never hear from me again and wouldn't get any money. At first, she pretended to be innocent and asked why I left and wouldn't come home. But Jake told her I knew about her and her boyfriend, Brandon, and her plan to divorce me. She realized she couldn't play games anymore. Since she was working as a waitress and struggling, she took my offer. I had to go back to Texas to hire a lawyer to prepare the papers. Caitlin was not happy when I told her I had to go. I explained it was important to put that part of my life behind me and promised I would return. I planned to drive to the airport and leave my car in long-term parking, but she insisted on taking me and wanted to be there when I got back. I think knowing I was leaving my car and all my stuff except for one suitcase made her feel a bit better. I left on a Sunday, and Jake picked me up from the airport. I stayed with him, his wife, and their 2 kids. I called Caitlin every night. By Friday, everything was ready. Jake took Janice to see my lawyer. They told her she would get $10,000 now and $40,000 in 60 days after the divorce was final. He showed her the check that would be held until the judge made a decision. She signed the papers, and my lawyer gave her the $10,000. I never saw Janice again. I thought about my things in storage. There were keepsakes from my parents and other items I wanted to keep. I decided I didn't want to come back for them, so I rented a moving van and loaded it up. Caitlin nearly panicked when I told her I wasn't flying back. I had to calm her down, and when I explained I was bringing back everything important, she got excited. It took me 3 long days of driving to cover 1,600 miles. On Tuesday evening, I arrived at Rocking Bee Ranch. Everyone welcomed me warmly, and that night we talked until early morning before we fell asleep, tired but happy. I was ready to start the next part of my plan, which meant I needed to visit the prison where Wilson was locked up. I wanted him to sell me his ranch. At first, he didn't want to agree, but I kept explaining my point. He would be in prison for at least 7 years. By the time he got out, his house and buildings might be falling apart. His cattle could die without someone to take care of them in the winter. I asked him if he thought people would welcome him back after his prison time. When he realized everything would be lost, he accepted my offer. This way, he would have something to rebuild his life when he got out. Next, I needed to find the money to make it happen. I moved my money back into the country. I was sure Janice wouldn't risk her $40,000 by doing anything silly. I got Wilson to agree on a price of $5 million. The property was worth much more, so getting the money was easy. I paid $500,000 up front and financed the rest. It took about a month to get everything done. I kept my plans a secret from everyone. This was hard, but I told Caitlin and Bill I had private business to take care of. It really only took me 1 or 2 days a week. I set up a brand new company and registered the land under its name. Summer changed to fall. I found someone to harvest the hay on the land. I also hired 4 workers to live on the property and help manage things. The most skilled worker became the temporary supervisor. I told him I would be away for a while, but I would be nearby. He could call me anytime, and I would visit the ranch often. The last thing I planned was to remodel the main house. It was a 2-story house with 5 bedrooms, but it needed updates. Even though Caitlin was frustrated that I wouldn't tell her what I was doing when I was away, our relationship grew stronger. I knew I loved her more each day, and I felt she loved me too. Caitlin's job as a veterinarian was going well. It required her to travel a lot, but she was happy. There came a moment when I almost told her everything. I had just come back from checking on the renovations when she confronted me. "What's going on, Carson? Are you seeing someone else?" she asked. "No, I swear there's no one else. I just have some personal matters to handle. Please believe me. I'll tell you everything soon. I love you, Caitlin. Just trust me and trust our love," I replied. Caitlin looked at me closely for the truth, and her expression softened. "Okay, Carson, I trust you, but you need to tell me soon," she said. It was spring, and the calving season had started when the remodeling of the main house was finished. It was time to put the last part of my plan into action. I waited until I had Caitlin alone one afternoon and asked her to take a drive with me. "Sweetheart, I've been thinking that it's time for me to leave the Rocking Bee Ranch," I said, trying to keep a serious face. Immediately her eyes filled with tears. "But Carson, you promised you wouldn't leave," she said. I had planned this moment when we were at the entrance of the old Flying W Ranch, where there was no sign on the gates. I turned in and began driving down the private road. "Well, I'm not going far," I replied. Caitlin looked around, looking confused, and I wasn't sure if she heard me. "Carson, what are we doing on Wilson's land?" I took my time answering until we reached the main house. "Come on, I want to show you something." I got out of the truck and opened her door. Joining hands, I led her to the front door and opened it. "Carson," she said urgently, "what are you doing? We could get in trouble." "Relax, my love. Wilson doesn't own this ranch anymore. Let's take a look. I want to know what you think of the house." Caitlin stared at me, shaking her head, but she followed me inside. I took her upstairs, and we walked through the bedrooms, then back downstairs. The living room was big. There was a nice den with wood panels, 2 rooms for offices, and a lovely kitchen. I could see by her face that she loved the new kitchen. Only 1 room had furniture. That would be my office. The rest of the house was open for her to decide. "What do you think of the house?" I asked her. "It's really nice," she replied. "Do you think you could live here? Carson, what's going on?" I could see she was confused and worried. I got down on one knee and reached into my jacket pocket. "Caitlin, Wilson doesn't own this ranch anymore. I do. I'm asking if you could live here. Could you live here as my wife?" "You own this?" she asked, her eyes wide with surprise. I nodded. "Yes." I then pulled out an engagement ring from my pocket and held it up. "Caitlin, I love you so much. Will you marry me?" At first, her face scrunched up, and I worried I had done something wrong, but then she hugged me tightly. "Yes, Carson, yes, I will marry you," she replied excitedly. She held out her hand so I could put the ring on. Caitlin looked around the house again with fresh eyes, exploring each room once more. I patiently waited until she ran back into my arms. "The house is beautiful. I love it," she said joyfully. I led her to 2 doors that opened off a hallway. "There are 2 offices, one for you and one for me," I told her. That brought a smile to her face. I took her into the office with the desk and showed her a large piece of paper. It had a drawing of a gate, and above it said Double C Ranch. Caitlin examined the letter closely, her forehead wrinkled in thought. "What is the Double C?" she asked. "That means the Carson and Caitlin Ranch." I noticed her eyes brighten. "Oh my gosh, that's perfect," she exclaimed. After we got ready and dressed, I told Caitlin it was time to tell her parents. She was so excited that she seemed to float to the truck. We returned a little after 6, and Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already in the kitchen for dinner. We walked in together, and Caitlin raised her left hand. "We're getting married!" she squealed. Colleen jumped up and rushed over to hug her daughter, while Bill and Sam shook my hand and patted me on the back. I then got a hug from my future mother-in-law while Caitlin hugged her father and Sam. Once things calmed down, we all sat down to eat. As the night wore on and the guests began to leave, I found myself standing by the fence, looking out at the ranch that was now my home. The weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was still to come, pressed down on me. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't afford to falter. Not now. Not ever. Tomorrow, the work would begin again. There would be no honeymoon, no break from the responsibilities that awaited me. And that was fine by me. This was my life now, and I was ready for it. The next morning, I was up before dawn. There was no time to waste. The cattle needed to be fed, and there was a section of the fence on the north side that still needed repairing. The weather was turning, and if we didn't fix it soon, the livestock could wander off, or worse, predators could get in. I didn't have the luxury of taking it easy just because I had gotten married the day before. This was the reality I had signed up for, and I wasn't going to back down. As I worked, I could feel the strain in my muscles, the exhaustion from the days leading up to the wedding still clinging to me. But I pushed through it, focusing on the tasks at hand. Bill was out there with me, not saying much, but his presence was a reminder that I was still being tested. Every nail I hammered, every board I put in place, it all mattered. There was no room for mistakes. By midday, we had managed to fix the fence, and I moved on to the next task, cleaning out the stables. The smell of hay mixed with the earthy scent of the horses as I worked, the repetitive motion of the shovel almost meditative. But there was no real rest, just a constant push to get things done, to prove that I could handle this life. As the day wore on, I realized that this was just the beginning. There would be no end to the work, no easy days. But that was what I had chosen, and I was determined to see it through. Caitlin joined me later, helping with the chores, her presence a quiet comfort. We didn't need to say much. The understanding between us was enough. By the time the sun began to set, the ranch was quiet again. The animals were fed, the fences were secure, and the stables were clean. I stood there looking out at the land, feeling a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was hard work, relentless and unforgiving, but it was also rewarding in a way that nothing else had been. As Caitlin and I walked back to the house, I knew that there would be more days like this, more challenges to face, but I was ready. I had made my choice, and there was no turning back. Caitlin waited until everyone started eating. "Of course, this means we will be moving," she said casually. "What?" Bill, Colleen, and Sam shouted together. "Tell them, sweetheart," Caitlin said to me. I nodded. "Well, Bill, you know how Wilson wanted to combine his ranch with yours? I thought it could be a good idea," I explained. Bill stood up, looking really angry. "There's no way the Flying W is going to get my ranch," he yelled. I smiled. "Bill, calm down. It's no longer the Flying W. It's the Double C Ranch, and the new owners are sitting at this table right now." "What are you talking about?" he shouted, now completely confused. "I bought out Wilson, and now the ranch belongs to Caitlin and me," I said. "Double C Carson and Caitlin," Colleen said, understanding right away. "Bill, I thought if we joined the two ranches, you could run them. We would split the profit 50-50, I added. "But the Flying, the Double C, is much bigger than my ranch. It makes a lot more money," he replied. "Bill, you have been doing this all your life. I need your help. I want us to be equal partners. You would be in charge of the work. What you say goes. Also, Caitlin has a part in this ranch, too. It will keep it in the family," I said. Bill sat down and looked at Colleen. She nodded. Bill reached his hand across the table to me, and we shook on it. "This will take some getting used to, but I accept your offer." "This means we will have more people to help, and that means Sam will be the main foreman," I said. Then I groaned. "And now I have to pull out all those fence posts I worked so hard to put in on that side of the land." Everyone laughed at my expense. Dinner that night was a loud and joyful celebration. Caitlin spent the night in my cabin, and we were late for breakfast the next morning, but everyone was still in the kitchen when we walked in. They were waiting for us to eat so we could all drive over to the Double C, and Caitlin could show us her new house. Everyone was impressed, and I saw Colleen looking happily at the new kitchen. It took Caitlin and her mom a month to furnish the house. It was ready to move into on our wedding night. We got married at the Double C. Bill and his family were respected and liked. Ranchers and their families from all around came to celebrate with us. As Caitlin's husband and Bill's son-in-law and the new owner of the Double C Ranch, I was welcomed into their community. It was late that night when we went to bed, but I wanted to focus on the bond we were building. On our third day of marriage, I took Caitlin to Fiji for a tropical honeymoon. Our first cattle roundup that year went well, and we sold a lot of cattle. We made a good profit. Much of mine went to pay off the loan, but with Caitlin's smart work, we were making a good living. We even built a nice new house for Sam, and he now has a girlfriend close to his age who lives in town. We might be having another wedding soon. Another year has gone by, and my wonderful wife just gave me amazing news. She's pregnant. We're going to have a baby, and we're driving over right now to tell the future grandparents. One last thing before I go. I know some will say I should have learned my lesson the first time and had Caitlin sign a prenuptial agreement. If so, you haven't really gotten to know my Caitlin. She is not like Janice. She works very hard at her job and takes care of our home. She is just like her mother and shares her love with me every day. Every time I look into her blue eyes, I see that love. Hey listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.